This is just a follow-up on an experience with the fallible or false dichotomy that people can often present. It leaves you in somewhat of an untenable situation. You might have to sympathize with Darwin as he noticed among the animals a seeming survival of the fittest. So I guess the big elephant killed the little elephant. But anyway, so these survival of the fittest constructs, and the most novel one, the most large, if you will, in scope, let's say the great conflict uh, that has implication from Genesis to Revelation and everything's at stake. So it was really the type I was fascinated to engage and evaluate. And fortunately, as an apologist, someone who identifies myself as that, I knew that without the proper hermeneutic, the apologetic is skewed anyway. So I could turn back to the Missionary Baptist Seminary. Yes, it's an unknown school by some, but it's well known by those who actually we just want to have the tools to study and learn. So looking at this that is now famous, and don't worry, if you're around people and you have to be careful, you're not around God's people. So relax, okay? So when people emote or accuse and they become angered and decompose, I just realized that, but for the grace of God, that could be me as well. I could be someone so ignorant as a result of ignoring the text that I too would be left with nothing but my emotions, and often those unchecked always lead to negation, ridicule, which is a ridiculous expression. Negation is something even Paul said he was once a slave to negative testimony. Even of Jesus, he said he's not the way, he's not the truth, he's not the life. So if Paul could refer back to a time in his life where someone as gracious and kind and loving as the way, the truth, and the life personified in Jesus Christ himself, who is everything he said he was, and he could speak ill against Christ, don't be so egotistic that you would presume it's something you should be immune to. But this here, young and old, for example, just ask yourself, what is that? Why? What does that even say? Well, nothing. It's probably, if someone asks you your age and you just said, well, I'm young. And if someone asks you your age and you said, well, I'm old. Well, in what conversation in just a common social setting would that be appropriate? Perhaps maybe on a social level where it's a custom here in the South, for example, to not ask a lady her age. But it would be remarkable to find people being satisfied with just a categorical expression. And this dichotomy of two, as many of our videos have referenced in the imcorne.org Apologetic and Outreach Ministry of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Arkansas, they've been talked about the religious mind is forever dichotomized. I found this great article in, let me see if I can quote the gentleman, give him the full credit for his work. But he talks about the tyranny of two, and I'll get to his name when I get to it. But he said recent research suggests that our brains may be pre-wired for dichotomized thinking. Now, this was just 8 years ago, 2010, and you can find this online. But he said some researchers are now extending this reasoning to suggest that the brain has a built-in tendency, when confronted by complex propositions, to selfishly reduce the set of choices to just two. Apparently, it doesn't like to work hard. Well, Dr. John Penn, for example, our hermeneutics professor at the Missionary Baptist Seminary, always told us how hard it was. Thinking's hard work, he said. That's why so few people prefer to do that. The Bible says much study is wearisome to the flesh. So it's of no surprise to us that we're going against the nature of our flesh, and that it would like to just follow its own inclination to avoid anything that requires any degree of critical thinking. And that's common to just anyone. It's not just a battle that we as believers face. It's everywhere. In the workforce, you find very few people, let's say, as I've learned in engaging companies around the world, someone will say, well, someone has been with our company for 30 years. Well, probably not. They've probably been there for 6 months picking up the things to get by with, break times, attendance policies, how to navigate in the company. And then for the last 29 and a half years, they've just lived off that very low level of information, wanting as little to do with understanding the operation of the company or something. So that's not an unusual thing. That's typical. He goes on and says that on the one hand, there is X, but on the other hand, we have Y. He says our common language encodes the effect of this anatomical self-reference. Now, if you study Koine Greek, that is not the case in Koine Greek. Koine Greek text will say on the one hand, but on the other hand, and then it will continue to extend beyond literally two-handedness that he's referencing here. So if you had studied Koine Greek, very highly inflected language, very wordy, very primitive, you would know that you have several texts that go on beyond. And I remember in a class where we were asking our teacher, and he said, well, on the other hand, this, on the other hand, this, on the other hand, that, and it just continued to extend. So it's a good observation, though, that perhaps we can only think of things according to our own instinctive understanding. But it says here, he makes a great observation. If it's likely that any one person's brain will tend to throw options overboard until it settles on a comfortable pair, then certainly our newsmakers have made dichotomizing their religion. Now that was remarkable because it appears that it is the basis level of thinking, and it is the most polarizing. And if you're looking for the greatest return on your investment, if it is to invest in the attraction of people, as we were taught at the Missionary Baptist Seminary, that a heretic draws people after himself. So it would be to the greatest return on the investment by the heretic to draw most people. That is, a heretic is someone who prefers something. And when we have the larger the dichotomy, the fewer the options, the greater return. So option fatigue, he calls it, option fatigue. It's like we just don't want to hear all these options. For example, there's things in the faith of Missionary Baptists, for example, when we talk about, let's say, the end of the age, the return of Christ, or the rapture of the living, you can hear things like pre-trib rapture view, a mid-trib rapture view, a post-trib rapture view, a pre-wrath rapture view. Then there's those who qualify the living rapture, qualifying it for only those who are faithful to participate in that. So it goes on and on. So you can see why people are really rather just tell me pre or post-trib. And then, of course, when you weigh those two options, post-trib is very much unpleasant. So you get your greater return if your preference as a person who is a heretic. That word means someone who advocates a preference. The word's not negatively. There's damnable heresy, but that's not the word heresy itself. You have to distinguish. Well, the Bible distinguishes that. So we all have our own heresies, preferences. So if you are a preferential type, where you want to broadcast the greatest preference or the most attractive preference, then just say pre-trib and then move on. And it doesn't mean that that's illegitimate. It just means that you'll suffer a lot of accusations no matter what you do, apparently. So, but there is a better answer than just picking among fallible constructs. If you notice in the Bible, there's a difference in the tribulation, the great, which in the Koine text is very definitive, and there's a very unique expression there. But again, that's back to option fatigue. People want to just get on with their lives, pragmatism, things like that. We're warned about all that in the seminary. So no, I don't find this surprising. But now this one's large. This has become almost life or death, almost eternal life or not. Do you even believe the Bible or not? It's become very extreme in the consequences that constantly leverage value towards one of these. So he says, okay, so we're predisposed to polarize, and not all polarization is dysfunctional. A lot of it is necessary and useful. But he goes on and says, how can we improve our thinking and reacting so as to liberate ourselves from the extremes of dichotomization? Well, Dr. Penn said, search the scriptures, then research the scriptures. Now, I quote Dr. Penn because I consulted him as I navigated this, because part of my dissertation work is what is it about people that seems to find them willing to prefer a construct and even take the Bible itself, which we're taught early on in Christianity, that one of the tenets of the Christian faith is to believe, support that the Bible is inspired. So then to subordinate it to a proof text level certainly goes against the very tenet and premise of Christianity. So I was curious, what was this? Now, of course, I'm not near as curious anymore, but this one's really fascinating because, he goes on and gives us some advice. He says, have fewer opinions. Well, we learned that in seminary very quickly. If you took ministerial practicalities, if you sat in pastoral counseling class, Dr. Penn warned us of the psychological realities we would face, even encouraged us to study that field. We were taught several things to pursue. He told us not to be afraid of anything, study it, research it, search it, and then research it. But he never really said have fewer opinions, just realize our opinions don't necessarily match what's written. Even the lessons of Christ, he said, well, you've heard this said, but here's what's written. So we were taught to go by what's written. This man goes on and says, keep your opinions and conclusions on probation. And that's just pre-understanding. You'll learn in the Historical Holistic Hermeneutic textbook that to approach the text properly, you should assume you're wrong, assume the error of omission, that you've omitted some things, and then, of course, approach the text inviting all the elements of it. He goes on and says, let go of the need to be certain about everything. That's presumption in the Bible. Seek the third hand. If you study the language, you'd know that that's in the Bible. He says, modify your language, replace the word but with and, because this is advice this gentleman's giving for the purpose of better performance, let's say, in workplace, organizations, education, whatever your field might be. But it's very much like what we contend with when in the seminary, for example, or when you pastor a church, you have these predisposed congregants as yourself. We all know we all are, but we want to dichotomize. And then they have fatigue option, and they really don't like to think about things. So when you're impressed with your ability to do a series through Revelation, you might find it not people's aversion to the horrors in there and the things that are said, but, you know, a man once told me when I was 26 years old pastoring a church, he came up to me afterward and he says, I can't remember the last time you preached a sermon where I didn't have to think to understand what you were saying. And I told him and sincerely said that I was sorry for provoking him to thought. So he was honest. He was saying, I didn't come here to think. Now, I just come here. I like the song, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Pass the plate. Let's make sure it goes all around. Let's hear the sermon. People go up front, get saved. Now let's go home, get the ball game on. Let's get to our afternoon nap. And he's a great guy, and he's with the Lord today. But he literally said, and honestly, he wasn't being rude or anything like that. He just said, he had to think to keep up sometimes. So it wasn't that I was talking over his head. That's not even possible when you go through the scriptures. It's just he didn't know, and nor did I at the time. I mean, I had some awareness through some very critical subjects I'd already studied. But you just don't find a lot of people pressing toward the table of thought. So he goes on and says that certain people's truth would not be the same as another's, and that's why we need to recognize the Bible as it's God's truth. So when we respect His truth, then we want to hear what His scriptures say, and that's as much a respect for the person who wrote the Bible. And we're taught, consider God first. As Dr. Penn said, most people's problem is not that they don't know the Bible. They don't know the God who authored it. So approaching and showing him respect, like you see people today respect all these people's opinions and all these people's religions and all their different views and all the multivariate perspectives. That's great. Now, why is it such a problem then for us when we ask men to show that same, at least that respect for God? So he says, avoid headbutting contests with opinionated people. Most opinionated people, Dr. Penn had a cure for that. Just personally, I was speaking in reference to something he had asked in class, and I was so convinced of my rightness and my correctness and my insight that he just continued to let me talk. And the more he allowed me to talk, the more I was convinced that, wow, he must really be eating this up. Well, all he was doing was like my friend Eddie Johnson. He discipled me, and my first year in the Missionary Baptist Seminary was my first year being a Baptist, and Eddie Johnson was very patient with me. And he was just letting me talk, because I think they all knew I needed this talk therapy, if you will. Okay, so his name is Dr. Karl Albrecht, and you can find this article, The Tyranny of Two, online. He has a website, karlalbrecht.com. Well, back to this. This is what's fascinating, and if you don't learn this in church, you should. You should learn this in church. You could have. And if you go online, you can see that this dichotomized thinking can be costly, because I wouldn't say go out and change the world and try to somehow deprive them of the convenience, because they don't really want more options. Sometimes it's just easier to say Republican, Democrat, right wing, left wing, conservative, liberal, and you're not really saying anything, because most people aren't really interested. It's like the issues when people vote. Have to be somewhat very serious. For example, today everyone agrees in the United States the value of life. Now, what does that include? Everyone believes in security, national security, but what does that imply? Everyone believes in security of our national and international interest. So our national security extends beyond. So just go down the list. But now, how do we find a dialogue in which we're all assuring that those things are improved, when sometimes things are now on the table today that were never on the table? Things are being discussed today that were never discussed. So fatigue option just boils down to people now say, I vote pro-gun, pro-life, pro-economy, and pro-national security, and pro-immigration reform. So you just take the view that secures the most return, and the rest is just people from the view of a conservative. For example, an extreme conservative would just be, the rest is just, people are wishing to quibble. So I guess in some ways it is very useful to be, I suppose, simplistic, but those are large topics that tie to the original premises of our nation. So I'm big on constructionism, the textualism. Why do we want to be an American, and why do we want to have anything to do with the United States if what's unique about us are still, the unique things about us are still held to be true in our founding documents? So yes, that would write me off by a lot of people, but it's like the Christianity. I still prefer what the texts say, even over what I say and what other people say. So back to what I learned about this was very fascinating, and Dr. Penn was always helpful, and he still is helpful. We work on a lot of stuff. So, but young or old, and of course this leaves out. So if you're young, you omit things, and it was unusual for me to see people omit actual text. So when you include, for example, one day as 1,000 years, you become accused of day-age theory, which we have proven that the day-age theory is not necessary, that you can prove by the literal days of the account in Genesis 1, you can prove the spherical nature of the earth. You can prove these numbers do mean something. They aren't in the Bible just there as token or gestures. You can prove that the account in Peter, one day is 1,000 years, that those are real numbers, and no, you don't have to then have an ambiguous understanding. But what was very striking to me was that, and you can prove the 360-day prophetic year, which in Daniel 9 prophesies to the day of the Messiah, and that's disputed by Jews for Judaism. And yet, Sir Robert Anderson's work, where he demonstrated a 483 times 360-day year, gave the 173,880 days that are from the 445 BC, March 14th in Nehemiah, and he goes all the way up to AD 32, showing the arrival of Christ. But how do you prove the number 360? Well, we did that. That is, when you include the text, the process of historical holistic hermeneutics. So what intrigued me was that in this case, neither one of these were even close. I mean, you can say old, great, but you might then not believe this. You could say young, but you can't prove this and can't prove that. And all you do is renounce this, and you don't find this useful. So being berated by people is certainly nothing. Didn't surprise me. I was doing the research on the web, gathering the feedback for my dissertation and work. But if you need to cope with it, isn't it amazing that the Bible, when we included it, for example, you don't have to go get numbers from science. You can just take the 360 days. This has been worked out many times. I've done this on many videos, and here's your one day, and here's your 1,000 years. Anyway, just you can show a young person, a person in elementary school. You can show them here in 12,500. This falls within that range that everyone says is so important, times 360 days. And then you get the 4.5 million days. You multiply that by 1,000 years, you get 4.5 billion. Yet people are like, no, that's not fair, that's not right. How would they know that since they never heard of it? That's what was so intriguing to me, was how could people be prepared? Well, it's because of the dichotomized thinking, and then they are negatively energized and they're primed. So immediately when you say anything, they jump to this is an accusation. But we found there is no reason to support a day-age theory. But we were accused of that. Now, accused is from categorize, and there's a book out called The End of Apologetics, and in that book it speaks of the consequences of apologists years ago, such as Socrates. He would be put to death if he didn't win his case. Today, we just have people unfriend us on Facebook or unsubscribe on YouTube, or say, we're not going to that church where you tell the truth and evaluate the text and give us the meanings from the Bible and don't condemn us and don't categorize us and don't call us old earthers or young earthers. And you see what I mean? So that's about all we experienced. And then immediately when we started talking, people started accusing of the gap or no gap, not knowing that the purpose of the gap, the convenience of it, by Bullinger, for example. If you don't know that word or name, look him up. But it was almost convenient for him to just place all the time that you couldn't account for in the Bible, just place it in there between verses 1 and 2. Well, that's not why those texts are there. Instant and spoken creation in verse 1. Verse 2 is where that original earth there. If you could prove what people are calling the Big Bang, the beginning, science says, was actually the ending in verse 2 of that particular earth. The debris falls through the sky. This earth is a very unique planet, uniquely prepared for habitation of man. God made Adam from the elements of the very earth that he composed from the, countless celestial fragments all out there. Young earth has no rationale for that. Old earth, no rationale for that. People were just so busy picking their sides and then moving back and forth as the pendulum swings. But what intrigued me the most here is that just to recognize relativity as known by those who are of the Hebrew Bible, Einstein, Teller, and Oppenheimer, who developed the nuclear technologies we have today and have assured that they're in the hands of those who have the world security interest in mind and responsibility. But the knowledge that the earth is spherical, the 6 days are literal, the 360-day prophetic year that supports the prophecy of Daniel of the very Messiah, the purpose of what happened in verse 2, explaining that it's a big ending, not the beginning, that verse 1 is actually spoken and instant and spoken creation, and yet no one can say why this bothers them. Now, we know why, and we understand it. And like the Bible tells us, we're patient with people that perhaps even they who are most angered and most incited to negate and to slander and to defame and whatever it is they're doing, God may give them repentance. So it's a joy to teach it. It's just this one here was the most unusual, because when we gave the answer, all we did was include and said these numbers are relevant, and even could show that Jesus said there's 12 hours in a day, so you cut this time in half to 6,250, and that's approximately 6,000 years. And we don't have to use an arbitrary, subjective, fallible, chronological calendar of Usher, and we don't have to use some broad, vast approximation. We can actually just take the numbers in the Bible. They do have meaning. They are relevant. We can take Psalm 90. It's relevant. Moses wrote it as well as the book of Genesis. We can take what Peter said in teaching his lesson. We can take the 1,260 days that are given to us in Revelation and the 3.5 years. When you divide that, you get the 360 days. So that's still not a proof of anything to anyone's satisfaction until you can sit down and show that the Bible had knowledge of the age of the earth, which is one thing, and then when did it come into existence? So scientists have no argument, except they do laugh at young earth, and others can't defend, that is, there are Christians who can't prove their old earth assertion to the satisfaction of anyone, and neither are correct. What scientist would want to honestly talk with someone, let's say like myself, in an open discussion and deny the fact that he knows time's not linear? For example, famous Neil deGrasse, he knows time's not linear. He knows the earth is rotating. He knows it's revolving. He knows it's traveling. He knows that as it reduces in speed, time accelerates. He knows there was 1,000-year lifespans and now 100-year lifespans. He wouldn't even have to consult the Bible to be able to do the arithmetic to demonstrate that, yes, under different circumstances, rates of time were totally different. And he would acknowledge that decay rates are different, whether you attribute it to environmental factors or to the control of time, which God says in his word very clearly that he controls that. It's totally irrelevant. So when you see a Bill Nye, the science guy, he's not. You see him bantering with Ken Ham, it's good to say, well, the bad guys are the scientists, and they're all atheists, and the good guys are all Bible believers, young earthers. But a young earther is not telling you how old the earth is. He's telling you when he believes it was created. An old earther isn't telling you when it was created. He's telling you how old it is. And neither are being honest with the nature of time. So it's disappointing to people when you solve all this, because the big truth that even I know and Dr. Penn often reminds me, we're not solving anything. The problem never existed. The problem never existed. So for me, as a first-generation Christian, especially only being a Baptist for 30 years, I was somewhat surprised. I mean, it didn't really bother me when Baptists berated me. I'm berated every time I saw problems in companies, every time I saw problems in people's lives, every time I saw problems in organizations, every time I saw problems in even religion. The good news is this dichotomized thinking has only brought to light that people of faith are as caught up in it and are as susceptible to it. It's regrettable only in the fact that Baptists are people who premise themselves, and I'm talking about a particular kind, of saying they're neither Protestant nor Catholic. That is, they're not of the two major theistic traditional expressions of Christianity. And of course, Protestantism is just in thousands of expressions today. So the unhappy Catholics have basically branched into multiple branches, and the classical Catholics still try to hold to whatever it is they consider their traditional views are. But the kind of Baptists that say they're neither Catholic nor Protestant really surprised me, that they didn't present that type of excellence in character or thought, I should say, when it came to a false dichotomy such as young or old earth. And I can certainly see how being lazy, yielding to the flesh, not studying to show ourselves approved unto God, workmen that need not to be ashamed, able to rightly divide the word of truth, could start spilling over. And now the Baptists, that say they're not Catholic or Protestant, we can act just like them, regrettably. But there's time always. God always calls men to come out. We come out, and then we are used by Him to help alleviate all this. So you have a blessed day, and thank you for your patience as I rambled on and on here. So have a